Good evening and welcome to Galloway Glens event, Stags, Saints and Skulls and the Secrets of Galloway's Caves. We're delighted tonight to have, first of all, the Galloway Glens area goes from Carsthairn in the north down through the Kendee valleys to Kirkcudbright and Castle Douglas. If you haven't been at one of our events before, it's stunning area of landscape, fascinating with renewable energy schemes and bucket loads of heritage and archaeology. So we're going to be looking at the coast tonight. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers. First of all, I'd like to thank Claire Williamson, who's hosting the night through our Can You Dig It project. And so welcome Claire, and Claire's going to be chairing a discussion at the end of the talk. So if you have any questions, you can pop them up on the Q&A, and Claire will pick up them towards the end of the presentations. So first of all, we have Nick Coombe, and Nick works for the Solway Firth Partnership and is passionate about heritage and landscape and stories. So he's going to be telling us stories linked to the caves. We'll have a short film clip with Nick before he starts talking through the presentation. Then we've got Andy, who's our regional archaeologist for Dumfries and Galloway, and we're delighted that he is our regional archaeologist. He's fantastic with a real passion for getting out into the landscape and exploring. Then we have David Devereux, who's retired curator of Stewartry Museum in Kirkcudbright, and is actively involved in many heritage organisations and fieldwork. And we also have John Pickin, ex-curator of Stranraer Museum and is a sought-after historical expert here in the south of Scotland. So thank you to everyone, and I will pass you over to Nick Coombe and our video clip.
So we're on the coast near Kerdale, and this is one of those places where, although it doesn't look like there'll be many caves, the whole of the rock face along here is peppered with holes of various sizes. None enormous, but each one has a name and a story attached to it.
So this specific cave, well, it's actually very hidden, isn't it? It's kind of a wee crevice, well,
yeah.
A big crevice.
Yeah, so I think this one is Carr Cave. So it's a name that relates to wildlife, Carr being Scots for jackdaw, or probably actually the red-legged jackdaw or the chough. So this was probably a nesting site for choughs in the past.
So, and this has some stories as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, it's linked with the Covenanters cave that's just round the corner called Weeks Cove, which is supposedly a hiding place for Covenanters. And when the dragoons were searching for them, they came to this one to look for the Covenanters, but didn't find any in it because it's not a very deep cave, so it's not a very good hiding place.
Yes, there's not a lot of places to hide in. They would have been pretty unpleasant spots for hiding.
Yeah, so quite a lot of caves are damp and not very nice places to be in. There are a few that are quite dry and actually have been used for people to live in different parts along the coast here.
I've seen that, yes, and I think we'll cover some of that in your
Yeah,
talk.
certainly, yes. People like Johnny Logie and the clown that was out at Ardwell Bay.
Yeah, it's definitely not something I would envy, the idea of living in a cave along the west coast of Scotland or any.
No, but of course, in much earlier times, then maybe it provided better shelter than many things that people could build.
That's a very good point. And I suppose if you were a Covenanter, if you were looking for somewhere to hide, at that point you're pretty desperate, I suppose.
Yeah, that's true.
And yeah, these are maybe quite safe, especially when the tide comes in.
Okay, so this is where we're going to see if we can find Meg Merrilies or Dirk Hattrick's cave.
Do you think there'll be any brandy still in it? Or?
I'm sure there's bound to be. There'll be a path somewhere, won't there? A well-trodden path. There is a rope here. So here we are, this is it. For the brave and the people who don't mind getting damp. And although it looks really narrow, it opens up into two biggish rooms inside.
Oh, that's quite impressive.
And you can see that this was a really popular tourist destination by all the graffiti that's on the walls. So if you start looking around you, you suddenly see lots and lots of writing and names. So, and everywhere you look. This is known as Meg Merrilies or Der Catterick's Cave, and that's really all based on the novel by Sir Walter Scott, Guy Mannering, which is a story of gypsies and smugglers, and this is the supposed lair of one of those two here. And it became a kind of Victorian place to visit and actually come and find and then leave your mark. This is the unique traditions, chiefly of the west and south of Scotland, by John Gordon Barber, and it was written in the 1830s. And it includes the Coves of Barhome. In portraying some antiquities of Scotland, and these antiquities somewhat connected with natural scenery, well may we notice the caves or coves of Barhome, in that bold and beautiful coast which indents the bays of Fleet and of Wigton. In the southernmost shores of Scotland, there yet remain several coves or caves. None are more remarkable for either their scenery or their antiquity than those we have mentioned. In a straight line betwixt the old castle of Barhome and the bay, and nearly opposite to the village of Garliston, there are three remarkable perforations in the rocks. The one next to Curdale bears the name of Cove of Barhome, that in the middle, the Carr's Cave, and the third since the days of Charles II has been named the Whig's Hole. Of the three, the last designed is certainly the most celebrated. It has borne its appellation on account of some Covenanters who for a time absconded here under the rigorous persecution of the House of Stuart, and a fitting retreat it certainly was. Indeed, two broad stones yet remain nigh the mouth of the cave, which is said to be the identical stones which the Covenanters had used to conceal their asylum. So I will give you an introduction to caves by looking at those with, or some with literary connections, to reveal the hidden stories along the Galloway coast. And to start in the Galloway Glens area, we'll be looking at Kirkcudbright Bay here. And the first one, this is Carlin's Cove. So John MacTaggart, in his 1824 Scottish Gallovidian Encyclopedia, tells us Carlin Cove was the hiding place of a Covenanter called Dixon. It's quite small in size and it seems an unlikely refuge, but recent research has revealed some truth in the story. A court case from 1684 identified Marion Mackay from Over Sennick, which is a nearby farm, as accused of helping a Covenanter called John Richardson, a name which presumably over time has been shortened to Dixon. And this must have been where he was hiding from at the time. We'll move on now to another cave with a Covenanter connection. So as we saw or heard in the film, John Gordon Barber in his 1833 Unique Traditions of Scotland refers to Whig's Hole as being a refuge for Covenanters. It's about 30 meters long, but it has quite a narrow entrance, as you can see here. It's large enough to crawl through though, and it's easy to close up with a boulder. So this is allegedly where the Covenanters hid while the dragoons were hunting for them, but were hidden safely. Nearby in the next slide, this is also, you saw in the film, this is Meg Merrilies or Der Catterick's Cave as it's known today, but Barber described it as the Cove of Barhome. And it only changed its name after, well, it's named after characters in Sir Walter Scott's fictional tale, Guy Mannering, published in 1815 and based in southwest Scotland. It seems local people were keen to identify local landmarks with the popular book by renaming this cave. And the graffiti that we've already seen at the entrance shows that it became an attraction for Victorian visitors. This is another cave with a literary connection. So this is at the rocks of Garhew, or as it's pronounced locally, Garkey, on the Macas coast. So this features in the writings by John McNeely,
writing under his pen name Ian Neal. And he describes family picnics to the coast in the 1920s, where his grandfather would spend the day talking to Paddy, who lived in one of these caves here, and give certain details of this Irishman who had decided to stop wandering and live in the cave, and he'd rigged up a bed in there, but that had a hessian covering to stop the pigeon droppings falling on his head. I've not found a literary connection here, but this is Johnny Logie, and he was another cave dweller. He was injured in a mining accident in Ayrshire and became deaf and partially sighted, and wandered around the coast of Ayrshire and Galloway until he settled in this cave here that was called Sheep Cave, but has long been known by locals just as Johnny Logie's. He lived here for about 35 years until he became ill and returned to relatives in Ayrshire in 1961. I can imagine after 35 years of living in a cave and then turning up and saying, "I'm home," would probably have been quite daunting. Unfortunately, he died the following year, age 72. So here we can see this is Sheep Rink Cove, and this is Johnny Purvis. And Andrew Donaldson wrote in the 1909 issue of the Gallovidian magazine about this cave in Ardwell Bay. It really is little more than a niche in a low rock face, but it was the home of Will Purvis. Apparently, in a long line of Purvis clowns, he worked in a circus as a clown and strongman until he decided to opt out and live in this little cave. He seemed to make a living by selling postcards of himself. So this picture here is in fact a postcard, and he also kept a visitor's book. So in the late 1800s, people would come along and seek him out during the summer and sign his visitor's book. He eventually moved to a summer house on Ardwell Estate before ending his days in a poorhouse in Stranraer. Red Cave is right just adjacent to Sheep Rinks Cove. I would have thought this was a far better cave to make your home in. It's a very dry place. And Andrew Donaldson also describes that this as being the temporary home to an Englishman who bizarrely then moved on to live in another cave just up the coast, also called Red Cave. I'm not sure why they were called Red Cave, other than I think the soil in this one has a reddish color, so maybe that gives us a clue. I've also been told that a couple lived in this cave for a while. The man was a bricklayer, so really you'd have thought he'd build himself a house, but anyway, he lived in this cave in the 1900s, somewhere around then. So Robert de Bruce Trotter in Galloway Gossip, 1877, describes the cave of Grennan having slightly different inhabitants. These were fairies, and superstitious travelers believed that it was lucky to leave offerings to the fairies and would often leave meat at the cave entrance as they passed. This also has another story connected to it, which is one that seems to appear on several caves. It's one where a piper enters the cave playing his pipes and then disappears, never to be seen again. This one has a twist. Not only might you hear the pipes from this cave, but his dog appeared several days later on the other side of the Rins Peninsula, rather ragged, came out of a different cave altogether. Unfortunately, this cave, there's been a rock fall here, and so it's actually, the entrance is now being covered in, so it's not a deep cave at all. It's little more than just a blip in the rock face there. And finally, yes, this is Piper's Cave. So this is again another cave with a piper in it. McTaggart, again, we can say thank you for him for the story. He tells a story of it being something to do with pipers and devils, different stories in different places, but again it seems to generally involve a piper who's disappeared into the cave and never to return. In fact, this cave is a natural cave, not very deep natural cave, but then extends many meters into the cliff face because it was mined in the 1770s for copper. So in fact, it's quite a man-made thing, and has a shaft halfway down, so it's still quite an interesting place to visit. And finally, I think just to finish off there, we have a fantastic coast, which everyone should get out and to explore if they can get there. This is the Needle's Eye, right adjacent to Piper's Cave. That's me, thank you.
Well, thanks, Nick. I think we're going on to Andy next, but that was mad. And really, I don't think anyone should ever take up piping, because they always seem to go in places and never come back out and haunt forever. Anyway, I'll pass on to Andy. You go, Andy, whenever you're ready.
Right. Good evening, everybody, or indeed good morning or afternoon, depending on which part of the world you're coming from, and looking at the wide range of locations coming up in the chat. This is a brief look at the archaeology of Galloway's caves. I was slightly daunted when Claire first asked me to do this. This is a map of the caves marked on Ordnance Survey maps from the first edition right through to modern editions. These are all the maps caves in Galloway, and I thought I was going to have my work cut out on this one. But in fact, the red dots mark the caves in Galloway for which any archaeological work has been done. And that reduces it down to the much more comfortable number of 7, one of which is going to be dealt with by John and David. That's Tor's Cave down at the bottom. And I'm going to, so I can happily discount that one from mine. Dirk Hattrick's cave that Nick was at hasn't had any archaeology done, though public visitors have indicated that there are signs of human occupation. I went onto Historic Environment Scotland's website, and it said Dirk Hattrick's Cave, Barholm, not to be confused with Dirk Hattrick's Cave. We do have 2 of them. Now, the first one that was excavated is on Cairn Ryan. For those of you unfamiliar with the region, down the left-hand side is the peninsula known as the Rins of Galloway, with Loch Ryan in the bottom and Luce Bay in the top. Then we have what they call the Maccas, the Wigtown Peninsula, Whitthorn Peninsula in the centre, and then we have the Stewartry of Kirkcudbrightshire off on the right-hand side. So we're going to start off in Loch Ryan, where we have a cave that was excavated in 1927. It's on the east side. They found some layers of charcoal. They found a flint layer. Their kitchen midden contains charcoal, bones, elements of a hearth, and a worn hammerstone. And the bones they found were domestic sheep. Interestingly, all very young sheep, and young oxen as well. And around the fireplace, they also found a number of pig bones. And when they looked at the deposit that was innermost into the cave, they found bones from hare and from a gull and from cod, and a number of hazelnuts, which the excavator described as gnawed by a vole or other small rodent, presumably in antiquity. These are the hammerstones. They're used we get them around the coasts. You can tell that they're not natural stones because they tend to have damage at both of the long ends, one or both of the long ends. They conveniently fit into the hand. They can be used for knapping flints. They can also be used for breaking over mollusks and seashells and so on, for food, and for splitting animal bones, for instance, for getting the marrow out. Though specifically on the Cairn Ryan cave, it does say that the bones were intact and hadn't been scooped out. Almost directly opposite it, above Kirkham House, we have a rock shelter, which has a kitchen midden to the rear of it. This was excavated again in 1927. The kitchen midden contained oyster shells and a large number of bones, domestic sheep and oxen. The bones in this case were more mature than the ones on the opposite side, and these ones had been hit and fractured in order to enable the marrow to be scooped out of them. and the hammer stones were found nearby. And the floor of the cave was covered with the bones of small animals and fish, as well as numerous beaks of birds. And outside we have a large stone that's flaked up on the surface, but it has small pitting on it, and it may well have been the sort of thing that they use like a blacksmith's anvil for actually breaking open the organic materials on with the use of their hammer stones. We have Uchtramachan Cave, which is just north of Port Patrick on the west side of the Rins. With the cave is on the right. There's a second cave on the left where with water coming down, and this is the use of water and springs and falling water as cures for various ailments is something that's noted in a lot of the folklore and history, oral history associated with a number of these cave sites. Macfarlane, writing in the early 20th century, describes the cave as accessible by 6 steps of a stair, entering a gate built with stone and lime, at the far end of which is an altar. But although he was writing this in 1908, when Leach excavated it in 1930, he found no evidence for occupation, certainly no structural features, and very little. Although there were fragments of charcoal, there was none of the intensive burning layers that had been found in the other 2 caves on the north, on the Rins. But again, like I said, the waterfall on the other side, the adjacent cave, is down, and as being of local interest. Excavated in 1930, this is the most recently excavated cave in Galloway. There have been no cave excavations for the last 90 years, and certainly none done up to modern standards. Just above the Mull of Galloway, looking over where you can see Galloway Lighthouse in this beautiful drawing by Herbert Maxwell in 1885 when he undertook a series of excavations down there. This is St. Meaden's Cave and Chapel, and it's overlooking this bay. As you can see, the 2 people in the centre are by an outer wall, and then there is an inner wall behind. So the chapel is actually uses built stone walls and the forepart of the cave. And then there is a doorway going through into the recess behind. And on this photograph, you can see clearly the 2 walls, the outer wall on the right-hand side, more walling added onto the bedrock, and then the large wall to the rear with the doorway just peeking in the bottom left corner. It's more clear in this image, which shows that the back wall, it's got a series of canted stones above the lintel over the doorway to try and take the stress away from the lintel stone, which would probably crack under the weight of all that stonework. But the stonework didn't hold anyway, and it has subsequently collapsed. When Maxwell undertook his excavations, he had a lot of problems on the site. There were traditions of a local holy well, and people from Stranraer used to bring their kids down here on May Day and dip them in the pool and so on. And apparently during his excavations here, he had a bit of a problem because the Sabbath day fell in between the excavations. He wasn't working on the Sabbath, but a party, what he described as a mob of locals, came down from Stranraer, dug up the excavations, knocked down the walls, threw all his finds and material away, and damaged all the work on the outer bit, and came back and completely trashed the site, leaving it for him to come back to a completely ruined excavation on the Monday morning, which means that although it was excavated by a very competent archaeologist, the record is particularly partial for this. He did find, it has been suggested by the Royal Commission that the projecting stones above the door that you can probably make out on this one may have held a first floor that was over the outer part of the chapel, And then further back into the cave, it had its own natural roofing. Most of the finds were made around the doorway, presumably because they did say when they excavated it that there was lots of evidence of previous digging inside it. So all that they found were copper coins of Charles I and II and farthings of William and Mary. They did find what they described as pieces of a draped female figure, but that was destroyed by the mob who thought it had papist overtones, and it was all broken up and hurled into the sea. And this is 1870. Maxwell did some further work and excavated the chapel floor, where he found one human tibia arm bone and portions of a deer's horn and some flints, which he had dismissed as strikolites. But they are, as flints and as potential strikolites, they're completely undateable. Earlier records from the site do indicate that medieval coins from David and Alexander in the 13th century were uncovered. So presumably, as the dwelling or as the place of a saint, and having these connections is being used as a pilgrimage site. Much more famously known as a pilgrimage site is St. Ninian's Cave out on the Macas Peninsula. This was subject to a series of excavations in the late 19th century as well. And in digging down through the 7 foot of rubble deposits and stonework that they had to get down to what they describe as the floor of the chapel, they uncovered a considerable collection of carved stones, mostly with crosses carved on them. The one that's set up at the back there was not originally in that position. One of these is now in the National Museum of Scotland up in Edinburgh. But if you want to see the rest of them, you're going to have to come down to Whithorn and see Historic Environment Scotland's Ancient Stones Museum there. But there, if you look at that is his drawing of the interior view after excavation. And there is a bit in the excavation record that says, after we swept the floor of the chapel, hence the broom out on one side. But you'll note that the stone that had been set upright at the back on the earlier picture was actually the basal stone of a set of steps going in. Now, this is a series of crosses known as the Cross of Arcs. It's an early Christian type of cross, and it's one of a number of different styles of cross that were found. Not only were there these separate crosses found, and here's the plan. So you can see the steps on there. And most of the lettering, except for the letter P on the right-hand side near the entrance, most of it denotes the location of the individual stones that they found. But not only were there separate stones found, there's also a considerable number of carved stones that are carved on the interior walls of it. There originally were known to be 9 of them, and a further 14 were discovered in a survey earlier this century. This one is a characteristic Northumbrian cross. If any of the audience were out on my archaeology walk for Newton Stewart Walking Festival a fortnight ago, they will have seen similar shaped crosses carved on the stones on Braidknop Fell up near Carstfair. But again, you can see in this drawing of them, we have simple line crosses. We have another very elaborate and well-drawn cross of arcs on the wall. We have these Northumbrian style ones with a little dot in the center, and then these distinctly cut in arms. And then we have what presumably are a whole series of just small pilgrim crosses carved in by individuals. But the crosses stylistically dates across from the 7th through to the 9th or early 10th century. So clearly it was although it's still used as a place of pilgrimage these days, and there is an annual pilgrimage by the diocese to Ninian's Cave, it clearly was a place of Christian pilgrimage quite far back in the past, from the 7th through to the 9th century. It's clearly been respected as a place of pilgrimage, and we know it continued to be a place of pilgrimage through the medieval period. And I will close with this one. This is shown on the first edition Ordnance Survey map as a cave. John Pickin will particularly recognise this one. When is a cave not a cave? When it's actually the entrance to an 18th century smuggler's cache. This goes back into the hillside and is one of a number of what we locally call brandy holes that are found around the coast. They've either been found through natural collapse like this. There's one down at Rockcliffe that was found when a farmer put a fence piling through the capstone of it. The army managed to find one at the Dundrennan Ranges by driving a vehicle over it, and we've had at least 2 where farmers have managed to drop tractors into them. So they continue to appear. This one is the most recently discovered one. Thank you very much, John. But it just goes to show that although we know of the caves, there's nothing to say that further ones won't be revealed. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. I'll just move swiftly on because we'll do questions at the end, but feel free to put them up through. We'll put them all to Andy at the end, and Nick and David and John. But I'll pass you on now to David, who's going to talk to us about Torres Cave.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. Right, hello everybody. Yes, we're going to focus in now on one cave in Kirkcudbright Bay, and this is Torres Cave. And we have to go back to 1977, when a German cave explorer brought 2 pieces of carved stone into the Stewardship Museum in Kirkcudbright. Both of them had very small animal carvings, a little bit difficult to see at this scale, but if you look at the right side of the stone, you can maybe make out a stag with quite prominent antlers at the top there. And if we look at the next slide, Claire, the other stone, again, had a very small drawing, but in this case, it's one of a monster with gaping jaws, a sort of sea monster with an eye you can see and possibly sort of looks like ears, but the jaws are very clear and the teeth. And both of these, as I say, came into the museum in 1977, and you can see them on display in the museum today. Now, at the time, in 1977, the finder told Tom Collin, who was the then curator of the museum, that he'd been exploring Torres Cave, which is on the east side of Kirkcudbright Bay. Here it is again, photograph taken from the sea. Quite a narrow entrance, as you can see, quite a difficult access to it. The explorer had been told that the cave had been fully investigated following the excavations there in the 1930s. And when he came across the 2 carvings within the cave, he, at the very end, the farthest end of the cave, he decided to chip them away from the walls and bring them to the museum. And subsequently, Tom Collin, the curator at the museum, sent the 2 up to Jack Scott, who was then the keeper of archaeology at Glasgow Museums, who thought that possibly the stag carving might be of Iron Age date, and the sea monster, which reminded him very much of a Scandinavian style. He thought that could possibly be Viking and might therefore be 8th or 9th century date. So in 2014, John Pickin and myself decided to revisit the cave to see if any more carvings could be found and to generally make an archaeological assessment of the cave. As I said, it had been excavated in the 1930s and the report was published in the Proceedings of the Society of Antiquaries in 1937 by the excavator, S.V. Wilson. and we've come into the cave in this photograph, and we're looking back, obviously, out to the opening. But you can see in the middle of the cave traces of what appear to be the rear of a blocking wall. You can see the courses of the wall there. John will describe the excavation in more detail, but as I say, you can see the structural evidence in this slide, and there have been a number of finds from the cave, going from the most modern 18th century pottery and such like, some medieval pottery, and also some Iron Age Roman material in the form of Roman Samian ware, the imported red ware from Gaul, and glass beads, glass melon beads, and fragments of a Roman glass bottle. So the indication, or the suggestion, is that there could have been occupation within the cave from the Roman Iron Age, at least, if not earlier. So on our visit, we took the opportunity to survey the cave, and this is the drawing, fine drawing produced by John, where you can see the entrance on the left, traces of the walling as we come into the entrance. So that was the blocking walling. And then the middle part of the cave, the main chamber, presumably the main living area, if we can assume that. And then you can see that the cave narrows over its 20-meter length to a fairly tight fissure at the right-hand side of the plan there, where from the description left by the caver, where the two carvings were removed from the walls, and he described them as being about 40 centimeters up from the floor of the cave. So it's right at the far end of the cave there. While doing the survey, we came across some interesting wildlife, notably these moths. These colourful moths are herald moths, and they're not uncommon in this area. You probably find them in most caves, and this is a group which are clustered together, hibernating. We were in the cave during the winter, and obviously keeping a very stable temperature within the caves. But this little group are presumably huddled together to keep warm. All very nice and pretty. But the next inhabitant that we came across, next slide please, Claire, is a little bit more fearsome. Now, this is quite a big spider. It's a European cave spider. Again, not rare along our coast and west coast of Scotland, but a spider that likes a certain habitat, particularly caves. Not one you'd see in your own house, hopefully, but cave spider. So John and I, as well as carrying out the survey for the plan, our purpose obviously was to look for any trace of any further carvings that maybe the original finder had missed. But despite looking very, very carefully, particularly in the area where he reported finding his two carvings, nothing came to light. But we did come across a lot of graffiti. Next slide, please, Claire. As with this one, and you can just make out the date, 1828, under the not very decipherable name. It might be McCuffock, that, but 1828. The earliest graffiti I think we found was of 1800, and clearly it was, a bit of an effort to get into the cave in the first place, and quite a effort to get to the far end of the cave, where a lot of people left their initials and their names, having braved all those fearsome European caves. John also described the two carvings and make comparisons with other finds, other similar carvings in other locations in the UK. So over to John.
Right, thanks, David. I'll carry on then. As David mentioned, The cave was excavated in the 1930s, but what you only realise when you look at the excavation plan is just how big an excavation this was. The drawing at the bottom left shows a section through the cave entrance, and all that material was removed during the excavation. From top to bottom, that was 25 feet high. You're looking at something almost 30 feet long, so a huge amount of material was removed from this cave. There's two interesting aspects in that. One is that when the cave was visited in the 1930s, the entrance would have been a little tiny hole at the top of this mound, which meant that all those Victorian explorers would have had a much more exciting descent into the depths than we do now. The other interesting thing is this wall, you can see, bottom left, 15 feet high. We can tell from the stratigraphy that that wall was built sometime during the pre-Roman Iron Age. It's not just a little wall blocking off the cave entrance, it's a massive stone structure. Was it defending what was inside? It seems very unlikely that you'd build a wall as big as this just to protect a little cave settlement. So I think something else was happening here. Unlikely to be defensive. Could it have been something more to do with cave ritual during prehistory? Now, of course, all archaeologists love the word ritual, but there are some reasons to suspect that. When Andy was talking about St. Medon's Cave, the Mull of Galloway, he mentioned the discovery there of a human tibia. Now, here in the packing of this Iron Age wall, they also found a human tibia, a human leg bone, and this one had actually been carved, had been worked for some reason, then deposited in the wall. Other caves in Scotland have other evidence for human use and human burial, maybe even human sacrifice during later prehistory. In the Covesea Cave up in Moray, they're actually decapitating people in the cave during the Roman Iron Age. Across the bay from here, in Kirkcudbright, at Bowness Cave, the Bone Cave, Victorian excavators found 2 children's skull caps. These had just been dated by the National Museum of Scotland to the Bronze Age. So strange things were happening in our Scottish caves, above and beyond just living in them. The other interesting thing here is you can see in the plan on the right-hand side, circled are a series of steps that go down from this wall into the cave. Other Scottish caves also have steps going into them. The cave up in Skye, again, has been used in the Iron Age for depositing ritual objects and human remains. A similar man-made cave with internal steps has been found recently on Orkney. So I think interesting things were happening here back in late prehistory. But does that help us at all with our carvings? Next slide, please, Claire. So we had a quick glimpse of these earlier, just to refresh your mind. On the left, we've got this fine little carving of a stag. On the right, we've got this monster with the curved open mouth. I think the point to make here is that both of these have been carved with a very, very fine point. Maybe a fine flint, maybe a steel or iron point, but very, very fine, detailed carving. The other point to make is just how tiny these are. If you look at the scale there, the stag on the right, he's just under 5 centimeters long. And the monster is probably just under 3 centimeters. So if you're trying to think of, giant cave paintings you see in the French Pyrenees, nothing like this. These are tiny, tiny little inscribed carvings. And the other interesting thing is to do with relative dating. David mentioned all the graffiti in the cave. Most of it where it's got a date with it, 1820s through to the late from the 1800s through to the late 1820s. And you can see here, when you look at the photograph of the stag, crossing over above the antlers, we've got this fine sort of cursive script, which is probably early 19th century graffiti. And you can see not only does it cut over and therefore is later than the stag carving, but also when you look at the colours, it's a slightly lighter blue on the inscription than it is on the carving, with the incision is more of a grey. So that tells us that the stag is earlier than the graffiti. Whether we're talking about a couple of decades or a couple of millennia is, of course, the unknown question. But certainly here with the stag carving, we know that the stag predates the graffiti. So we do get cave carvings elsewhere in Scotland. One of the best known sites is Weems, the Weems Caves in Fife, where there are a whole series of carvings. A lot of them stylistically are Pictish or early medieval. Here, one of the best preserved is this horse. Well, it looks more like a cow from here, but it's apparent horse. And I think the interesting thing here is just how big this is compared to our tiny little carvings. It's also a much more naturalistic portrayal of a beast than our carvings. Other examples of Scottish cave carvings: King's Cave in Arran. The walls there are covered with graffiti. Some of it certainly, if not Pictish, early medieval through to classical medieval period, a lot of later graffiti as well. But you can see that sort of horses or quadrupeds in general are quite common in that cave. But again, much, much bigger in scale than ours. Sculptor's Cave in Moray, one which has definite Pictish carvings of fish and Pictish symbols on the walls as well. So where we have known cave carvings elsewhere in Scotland, they aren't like ours at Torres Cave. So can we get a date on our Torres carvings? Well, here's our stag, and let's have a look at some other examples of Scottish or British animal carvings. Very recently, I think in the last 12 months or so, at Kilmartin Glen, a fascinating discovery under the capstone of one of the late Neolithic or early Bronze Age tombs, a carving of two stags and a thing that might be some sort of quadruped. These are the earliest known animal carvings anywhere in Scotland, some of the earliest in Britain. When you think of Neolithic and Bronze Age carving, rock carving, you tend to think of cup and ring type stones. They're all abstract. What this is showing is that we are actually getting naturalistic carving, at least by the early Bronze Age, 4,500 years ago. But these things at Kilmartin, beautiful though they are, they're pecked into the rock, a very different technique from our carving at Torres. A bit closer to home, here's a fine carving of a stag on the coast at Eggerness in Wigtonshire, so only a few miles west really of Torres Cave. You can't quite see it in this photograph, but it's a much more stylized drawing or carving than the one in the cave. Not only have you got this fine depiction of the hooves and the legs, but you can see the fine twirling lines inside. A much more competent carving. It can't be dated exactly, but it's probably medieval, possibly early medieval. But again, stylistically, very different from our simple stag in the cave. Is it more similar to this? This is an early medieval slate carving from St. Bute's, St. Blaine's Monastery on Bute. You can see in that top picture a very crude carving of a little stag being pursued by hounds. Thought to date from maybe the 800s to 900s. And yeah, there is some similarity, but it's just really a similarity of crudeness. Or here, much more, I think a much better parallel, but here we aren't looking at anything particularly ancient. This is a medieval carving, a really medieval graffiti from a church in Suffolk. So I think looking at the stags, we can find parallels, but none of them are closely datable. And really our closest comparison, I think, is this bit of late medieval graffiti. So let's look now at the monster. So as David said earlier, when Jack Scott looked at these carvings, he thought that maybe this monster head could have some sort of early medieval, possibly Scandinavian Viking connections. And I think that actually still holds true. We don't have direct parallels in Dumfries and Galloway, but just nip across the Solway into Cumbria, where there's a good corpus of early medieval Viking carving, including quite a few with these sort of monsters. The one at the top is now a lintel outside St. Bees Church on the coast. You can see here we've got some sort of armed figure fighting a dreadful looking sea monster or a dragon. But you can see these ears and the big sharp teeth, the curved mouth. An even better parallel perhaps is here on the Gosforth Cross, the churchyard at Gosforth on West Cumbria, where amongst a whole host of various designs, we've got this interlace with two beasts' heads at either side. These upturned mouths curving back, very similar to our Tor's monster. It's got this backward projecting ear. The one on the left, devouring that man, has a tongue, but the tongue there is forked. Our tongue is just a single slash. And both at St. Bees and at Gosforth, the beasts only have a single tooth, top and bottom, while our beast in the Tor's cave, has a full dentition of pointy teeth. So similarities and dissimilarities. So going again to church graffiti, same church in Suffolk, here's the monster's head. Again, I think quite a good parallel. Are we looking at early medieval, or are we looking here at late medieval bit of graffiti? Again, pays you money, takes your choice. But interestingly here, this one at Troston, this demon's head, this monster's head, is carved close to a high window. It's meant to be not just a bit of graffiti, but maybe a bit of sort of deliberate protective symbolism by having these sort of carvings or these images next to points of entrance into a building, especially a church. Are you protecting that building from demons, from evil forces? And is it maybe interesting, and this is pure speculation now, our two carvings were found right at the very end of the cave, but in fact that's not the end of the cave. It does continue as a very, very low passage, which neither David nor I were brave enough to crawl into, but it does continue. I wonder if maybe that monster head was placed there as some sort of protective device. Was there something further down in the cave they wanted to stop getting out? I don't know. But you do find a number of caves, evidence for these protective marks. This is Creswell Crags in Derbyshire. These W's are all what are called Marian marks. They're double V's, which are meant to represent the Virgin Mary. You carve them on the rock wall to protect you from whatever is inside. A Wookie Hole in Somerset, there's a whole mass of these in one single part of the cave where there's a very cold air blast comes out in summertime, suggesting perhaps there was something rather unpleasant deeper down in the cave. So, I throw out the idea, maybe the monster head was there to protect not just the cave dwellers, but the inhabitants of Dumfries and Galloway from something evil which had to be controlled deep in the cave. But could they just have been part of the graffiti that was being carved on the cave walls sometime in the 18th and early 19th century? We saw earlier, we know that the stag carving predates some of the graffiti, but we don't know it predates all the graffiti. So, as earlier on, I think it pays you money and takes your choice. I think they're probably later rather than earlier. I think you might be looking at medieval, post-medieval, people being attracted to the cave. But caves throughout time have always had this, people being fascinated and also appalled by caves. And that's where their fascination lies. Across the bay, as mentioned earlier, was Bourness Cave, the Bone Cave, excavated in the 1870s. A cave which should really be re-examined, as should all our caves. But just put this up because at the very end of the excavation report, the excavator said there are other caves nearby which could also be home and refuge of some ancient Scottish family. He says, "These remarks are made in the hope that someone may perhaps be induced to make further investigations in these caves, and so throw more light on the cave inhabitants of the southwest of Scotland." And that was 1876. Andy mentioned earlier that the last cave excavation in Dumfries and Galloway was 1930. But there's not really been that much work since the 1870s. So really, we have, I think, this incredible potential in caves, archaeological, folkloric, geological, throughout the whole of the Dumfries and Galloway coast. Some great potential projects out there. But we waited 150 years for one to start. So maybe the time is right for a bit of further cave exploration. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. My screen. Yes, we've had a few comments coming in. Everybody sees something different in the monster. I think that's safe to say. So we've got a lot of people thinking of birds. Somebody suggested a conger eel, and somebody combined it to say maybe it's a dragon bird. So there you go. Could be. And also, just before we move on, because there was somebody, I'm not probably saying it right, but apotropaic marks, which is always the word I'm trying to think of. But yes, somebody mentioned that. Sorry, I can't remember who it was, but somebody else was asking what they were. They're the carvings. So that's what John was talking about when you put markings on as kind of protection against curses and witches and things like that. That's what apotropaic, specifically the name for those markings. Anyway, right, now to the questions. So I'll work my way through them, but feel free to put more up. So the first one is for yourself, Nick. Where do you think Scott got the name Dirk Hattrack? Did he make it up, or was it a local name he pressed into service?
I think that there was a tradition that several smugglers had Dutch connections, so I think he used a Dutch name. Certainly there was a famous smuggler, I think, called Yorkins, who was Dutch and was well known for his exploits, so it was probably using that as inspiration, but someone else might know more than me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, feel free if anyone has ideas. Right, I'm just gonna, and Bradenrock was saying as well, oh, I'm gonna say it wrong, Garhew, is that how you say it? Oh,
yeah, so it's spelled Garhew, but it's locally it's pronounced Garkey.
Yeah, he was saying that it stands for the rough quarterland, hence the local pronunciation you mentioned, which is an approximation of the Gaelic. And he's got a longer Gaelic phrase there that I'm just going to read. That's in the Q&A. I'm not going to try. I think we'd be here a while. And then there was a couple, Andy, during your talk that I noted down from Helen. It was asking a couple of dates. One was the rough date for the hammerstones that you mentioned, and also a date for use of St Medon's Chapel. Because I think there was maybe a few phases for St Medon's, was that right? But
there's a few phases for St Medon's, and because of the damage that was done during the excavations, we have no secure dating for it. There is clearly use in the medieval period, and there's use through the post-medieval period. But just how far back again, and obviously the other thing relating to what John was saying, and I was dealing with in terms of there being no recent excavations, nobody has excavated a site since we got carbon-14 dating. So we've got all these descriptions of fire pits and bones being found around them and so on, and clearly quite good charcoal deposits. But unfortunately, they're all excavated before carbon-14 dating came in. So we could probably answer the questions a lot better if more recent work and more recent techniques were applied to them. Hammerstones are genuinely problematic. They're stones. They are undatable. Some of them are thought to be Mesolithic. Some of them are thought to be Neolithic and Bronze Age. We find them on Iron Age sites. We find them in, you can use them just as you would do, for instance, for mortar and pestle and so on. There are things you can use them for. Monks would have used them for crushing pigments, for illuminating manuscripts. They have uses right the way through, from the Mesolithic right the way through to the medieval period, and it's only probably subsequent to the Industrial Revolution, when we get specialized things for specialized tools for jobs, that people will stop utilizing them. I have one. I have one. I still use it. It was a stray find, but it's still used.
No, that's great. Thank you, Andy. So yes, open to interpretation there. We've got Niall says, so this will be for David and John, and I think it's actually what we all ask. Why did the caver chip away the pieces rather than invite experts to view it in situ? Any ideas? It seemed an odd way to go whenever you hear the story. Anyone? No.
There is correspondence between the finder and I think with Tom Collin and Jack Scott at Glasgow. There are letters in the museum about this, and I get the feeling that he began to realise that he'd made a bit of a mistake, and perhaps should have left them there. But he did seem to be under the impression that he says he was told that there was no further interest, that the site had been excavated. So he maybe thought, well, if I don't do something with these, they'll just be forgotten again. I've found them. I don't know if anybody's going to be interested. I don't know if anybody's going to come out with me. So I'll just take them off the walls. When John and I were in, I think we did, and John maybe confirmed this, I think we maybe expected that even after about, 14 plus, it would be, how many years would that be? 37 years, that you might see some evidence as to where, you could see the place where the stones were removed. But as I remember, there was just a sort of consistent layer of, I think, calcite over the wall. So, although his descriptions were quite accurate and as to where he found them, but it would have been nice to actually see more evidence. And he must have very good eyesight to spot these things as well, as John was saying, very small. And he must have been right down amongst the cave spiders looking at these things. Maybe the idea that he realized perhaps he should have, when it became clear that maybe they were of actually quite some archaeological interest, he maybe should have, perhaps began to dawn on him that maybe he'd done the wrong thing. But there you go. Had he not reported them, we wouldn't be talking about them tonight, would we?
That's true.
Had he not, I mean, yeah.
Well, yes, it's impressive he found them, especially that small. I'm surprised when you see how small they are and that far back in the cave. But yeah, we generally don't encourage people to put out the carvings from the cave walls, just for future reference. It's a strange choice. Okay, so we've got Kirsten, and I think that's more about carvings again. The graffiti that she's seen in caves looks like it's almost been stenciled in. Very well done. How would they achieve this? I suppose, some of them are very neat, the actual carved in ones. It must take quite a while to anything.
I think if you go to any soft rock face, you'll find graffiti, and the further back you go in time, often the better it gets. And especially, I think no one's really done a proper graffiti survey. There's another thing for the future, but my gut feeling is that sort of late Victorian, Edwardian times, people really, really went to town with beautiful, big graffiti that would have taken, half a day to make. Obviously, the landowner, they won't bother about the landowner. I wonder if it was to impress boyfriends and girlfriends. I mean, all these things are all to do often with, sort of love tokens. Maybe the grander and more elaborate your graffiti, the more you pledge your troth or whatever. Yeah. But there is some wonderful stuff out there. But all done by hand and a steady hand and a good eye, I think. No stencils.
Yeah, I like it. Jan, did you raise your hand or something?
Yes, I was really interested. You made a comment earlier. Somebody had put up something about the dragon bird, and I was interested because um, I'm from an arts background, so I tend to read things visually. And I certainly, when I first saw that carving, I saw a bird, didn't see a dragon. But then I was thinking maybe it's an ambiguous. We assume everything has one meaning, but maybe actually in the past, especially pre, writing, that actually these visual carvings had more than one meaning or multiple meanings. I just wondered what people thought about that.
Yeah, no, I think.
Yes, I mean, I think no reason why not. But it's this problem. It's this thing of, we can read too little, we can read too much into these things, and unless to begin with you've got some idea of date, it's so hard to provide a sort of a social or an artistic context for what they're all about.
That's it. And I think because it is so hard to interpret these things and the further you go back. And I think going back to kind of obviously the Pictish carvings, very famous up north, and things like that. And I know that recently they've tried to work out that they think sections of it are parts of names, just the way that they keep repeating kind of things. So they actually think that that's what it's like, some of the wee circular kind of diagonal symbols that go up. But I think you're right, Jan, that it would have to be a bit of an ambiguous kind of open meaning, especially when it looks to be, unless it's an eel, looks to be a mythical kind of creature, that you would think there'd be multiple meanings and everybody can look at the same thing and see a different. Yeah, it's very interesting and makes it harder to interpret, I think. You have to be very open, I think that's it. Somebody was saying, Lydia was saying that Torres Cave continues to be the site of nefarious activities. Also, Lady Bay, about a quarter mile away, has been dated, signed 18th century names, thought locally to be sailors biding their time for the tide. There you go. Must have been waiting there a while. I had a few hours to kill. Okay, Bradennock is saying, yes, can you send some kind of robot down the recess of Torres Cave? So is this the bit at the back that nobody wants to go? I don't know, yeah. Oh, you go. Battle through the cave spiders. I don't know how, it was pretty inaccessible through the back, isn't it?
I think a thin and dedicated caver could probably get through with a bit of willing. I'm certainly far too big now. David actually would be a good shape. I think we should go back, David, and I'll encourage you down into there.
I'll take a rain check on that, John.
No, I think joking aside, obviously there is more to the cave. Whether we're talking about a couple of meters or more is an unknown. And theoretically, you could put some sort of probe down there. What you wouldn't want to do necessarily would be to try and dig it out, because we don't know what archaeological damage might be incurred in the process.
That's true. Yeah, they dug out quite a lot. But yes, I think Andy's offering. So there we go. We can all stay outside and have our sandwiches by the beach, and Andy will go down the recess and we'll give you a rope to tug on, Andy, if you need help. That sounds like a fun. So Fiona was asking, would prisoners have been kept in caves? This is something I have heard about for other caves, but not proven. I don't know, anybody come across an example of that? There was one story of it to do with Ballantrae Cave. That's that one, but that's a wee bit open to interpretation. Oh, Andy, do you know of somebody?
No, that was a hand from earlier that disappeared.
Oh.
I still want to make comments on that deer.
Oh, have you got deer comments? Oh, I didn't realize. Oh, well, we can come back to that whenever you want to make some. You want to do that now before we move on?
No, if you do it now, some of the people will say, I put a couple, but it's to toss one out to John and David. In the chat, I put a couple of images into chat, but I can see distinct parallels between that deer carving and the deer that appears on one of the coins from Whitthorn. If you disregard the snake symbol over the back of the Whitthorn coin, you can actually see it's got very similar leg positioning, very similar horizontal back, and it's from one of the Northumbrian coins at Whitthorn, but as shown in my second image that I put up, it's actually part of a tradition of deers on coins that are found throughout Scandinavia in the early medieval period. And I would postulate that it might be contemporary with your dragon.
Okay, that's an interesting. I can't quite find your. I'll say that later. But yeah, I think what's
8:29 p.m.
Okay, I'll find it. I think what is interesting is that when we first went into the cave, we did a little report on this. One of the things we wanted to do was just really make more people familiar with what was in there, and so get more people feeding back with exactly that sort of information, good parallels. And obviously, the more parallels we can find for these carvings, the better our chance of getting a more precise date. So that's great, Andy. Stuff like that really does help. And of course, anybody else out there who's also been looking at this and go, aha, I know a good parallel for that monster or whatever, then yeah, please put something on chat and let us know.
Sorry if I don't think we've got any known examples for prisoners, but yes, that's what I'd heard for Ballantrae, one of the stories, but it wasn't confirmed, and I don't think anyone's come across it. But I wouldn't be surprised, since there's so many other instances. I'm swapping between the chat and the Q&A, so I'm back over to the Q&A. So I've got Stephen from Kilmarnock. Where would I find a detailed map of the Galloway Caves? I shared a link in the chat for the Solway Firth Partnership booklet on caves and graves, which has some of them, but it doesn't have all of them. I wonder, is the best place maybe Pass Map, maybe? What does everyone think, or does somebody know a better example?
Pass Map has all of the ones that have had excavations and material from them. But I mean, the map I posted up is literally taken straight off the Ordnance Survey map from the first edition, second edition, and the current online mapping.
Yeah, I would say first edition is the most detailed as far as caves is concerned. So you can find all the cave names and locations in that. But I think it's the second edition, or it might be the slightly larger scale map, where the caves actually often show how far the cave goes in, and it's a little bit more detailed as to the exact location of the.
And all of these historic maps are available for viewing at the National Library of Scotland's website.
Yep.
If you just pop in if you just do an internet search for National Library Scotland maps, you'll be able to get in and find them. And Pass Map is just passmap.co.uk, I believe, but it has all the archaeological discoveries that have been made in Scotland, and you just zoom into an area and you can click on and get information and all of that. So those are two good resources to have a look at. Thank you, everybody. We've got now Rippin' Rabbit, or Ripin' Rabbit. I'm going to call you, yes, I like it. I'm going to call you Rabby. So this is a question for Nick. You mentioned that copper was mined in the 1770s. What was the earliest copper mined in this area, and was a lot of copper mined?
Ooh, that's definitely a question for John, not Nick.
Oh, is it for John?
Yeah.
Very, very quickly. There's a possibility of Bronze Age copper mining in a place called Tondagee near Whitthorn. Can't be proved, but fairly good circumstantial evidence. They're going way back into the Bronze Age. Pretty much then is dead. There's no mining at all up until about 1750. And then there's quite a small but locally intensive copper boom, 1750 through to about 1820. And then it all begins to disappear again. So about 100 years, there was quite a bit of small scale copper mining and lead mining going on in D&G.
These have come in at the same time, so I'm going to go with Elaine was saying about local folk that have been doing the fishing around, maybe they'd be a good source for stories and have different knowledge of the caves. Were you able to talk to some of the locals when you were researching tours, or anybody else, or Nick actually, when you were doing your kind of research into the various stories?
Yes, I certainly spoke to fishermen about cave names. They often used caves as sort of landmarks for working out different fishing marks and things, but I don't remember there being many I mean, there were stories about them, about some of the holes and names that there are along the coast, but nothing that was particularly archaeological relevance, I don't think. But they are, yes, local people are the best people to find information about these places.
That's great. Lydia was pointing out that anyone thinking of exploring Torres Cave, it can get filled very suddenly by the tide and is pretty dangerous. So yes, please, everybody hold it. You have to watch when the tide is up, and you also have to watch because it's at Dundrennan firing at the military range. So you have to make sure there's no red flags up and it's free. So best to wait, and we'll let you know how it goes when we send Andy down to check out what's going on. Everybody else, stay safe. No, you'll be fine, Andy. Okay, so Rabbi's back saying, for Andy or anyone who can answer, why have there been no recent excavations in 90 years? Bureaucracy, financing, laws, curious why?
All excavation is expensive, and probably because it hasn't occurred as a research topic for anyone. What it needs is a doctorate student at somewhere like Edinburgh or Glasgow looking for a fieldwork opportunity to go somewhere nice. We do suffer from a certain lack of research in D&G, but that's because a lot of people from Scottish academic archaeological institutions like going out to the Western Isles or the Northern Isles or somewhere far away from Edinburgh to follow up their research projects. So I think it's an area that we haven't had anybody with a particular focus on. And the usual thing in archaeology these days is, outside of specific research studies and outside of work, that there is very little work that is done outside of the commercial field of archaeology ahead of development. The overriding principle of archaeological policy in Scotland is to leave things in the ground wherever possible. You don't excavate unless you have a particularly good reason to excavate, because the work we do now is so much better than the work that might have been done in the 1930s, but that's better than 18th century antiquarians who used to dig a hole in the middle of a barrow to get the goodies out of the middle and then go home, having done 7 barrows before tea time. So techniques improve over the years, and in general, we would prefer to see the archaeology preserved in the ground unless there was a pressing need, or unless somebody had a particular set of research objectives that required them to go and look at large hills southeast of Lockerbie.
John, were you going to say something?
Yeah, just I think on top of that, cave archaeology is something which goes in fads, historical fads. Back in the 1870s, 1880s, there was a huge interest in caves throughout the whole of Europe. And so people were digging all over the place. Then it disappeared. And then again in the 1920s and 1930s, there was a lot of cave archaeology in Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire and Devon. It began to spread. And that's when we see the excavation tours. And then by the time of the Second World War, the interest in cave archaeology decreases. And I think we're still in that. Although in the last couple of years, there has been quite a bit of excavation up on the Moray coast and caves there. So maybe that will kickstart another phase of sort of Scottish cave archaeology.
Yeah, well, that would be good. And just for yourself, John, Tim has shared a couple of links in the chat. So you might be able to scroll through and find them. So I'll let you have a look for those. But it's about looking at Celtic knotwork design and dragon beast and all that kind of thing. So he's got some examples there, so I'll let you have a wee look, John. Although actually saying that, the next question's for you. So I'll put a pause on that. Rabbi is asking, what are the scale differences between the ones found versus your comparison slides? And not saying that he did, but has anyone suggested that the man who pulled them had perhaps forged them? How were they authenticated?
Well, I think certainly in terms of size, all the other ones I showed were considerably bigger. I don't know the size of the Suffolk ones because I took those from something on the internet without any scale. But I think it's fair to say that ours are tiny, tiny, tiny compared to all the others, which may or may not be significant. I don't know what David's thoughts are on the forgery side, but from my point of view, certainly with that one of the stag, because it's cut over by what we think is probably early 19th century graffiti, it's very unlikely that he would have, our German cave explorer, would have forged to that degree of accuracy. So that suggests to me it probably is a real find, and therefore the other one is too. What do you think, David?
Yeah, I'd agree, John. The graffiti over the stag is, I think, convincing of its antiquity. I think Jack Scott was also, although he came up with a couple of dates, he wasn't entirely sure, but he was fairly convinced they weren't modern. We're taking on his word that the caver found these where he said they found them, and I can't see any motive for him, to come up with a totally spurious story. He wasn't looking for payment for these. He seemed genuine. All subsequent correspondence shows that he was interested. He had a history, I think, of cave exploration and mine exploration. So I've got nothing suggests anything to doubt, the truth of what he was saying. But
that's great. I was going to say, there's been some links shared for, I think it was registry. I don't think I've looked at that. Is another .org.uk is another place you can search for most known caves in Scotland by location. That was Neil, I think, that put that up. And Selena as well. Registry.gsg.org.uk. And I saw Jill asked a question, but I think Andy answered back about there being a cave on Heston Island. And then a final question in the Q&A comes from Pam. What was carved onto the human bone and is it viewable? So is that for yourself, Andy? Or did you have carved bone?
That's David.
Is that David? Is that you, David? Sorry.
John mentioned that, I think.
Everybody looks at John.
Okay, I'm going to actually throw this back to David in a second because the bone is illustrated in the report that was done in the 1930s in the Society of Antiquaries. But it says that the finds are at the Stewartry Museum. Now we know that most of the small finds, the beads and the pottery, are there. Do you know, David, if the bone, the human bone, is part of that same collection? Or has it been dispersed somewhere?
Yeah, I know there's bone, but I wasn't aware of the human bone, John. No. I'm not sure. I can't say actually. It was never displayed as such. Put it that way. The material was on display, but no, it's something to check. Clearly.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And Pam was saying that she did some cave archaeology as a volunteer on Isla a few years ago. So get whoever was doing that cave archaeology over here. I'm encouraging. But I think that's all the questions. Thank you so much, everyone. And thanks for answering them all.
Just to say thank you for the amazing sharing of information about caves tonight. That was absolutely wonderful, absolutely fascinating. It was lovely to see so many people joining us from all over the world and from Dumfries and Galloway sharing links and knowledge and ideas. So really, really great. So thank you, Nick. Thank you, David. Thank you, John. And thank you, Andy. And a big thank you to Claire for chairing that discussion at the end. We have a number of events. If you can keep your eye on the Galloway Glens Eventbrite page. We've got some test pitting happening at Chapel Yard in the 9th, 10th and 11th of June. And we've got rock art test pitting as well on the 23rd and 30th, both Thursdays. And then in July we have Woodhead Building Survey happening. So there's lots of real life practical things that you can get involved in if you live in Dumfries and Galloway, or if you want to come here on a holiday. It's a very beautiful place to visit, so please do. So again, just thank you very, very much to everybody for joining us, and thank you for Historic Environment Scotland for funding this programme. Good night.